Hi, my dear friends. Some words of Torah for Parshat Yitro. We've gotten to know Moshe Rabbeinu over these last several parshiot. We've seen his character as a man of great integrity, who is sensitive to the plights of others and wishes only to help those less privileged. We briefly met his wife Tzipora in Parshat Shemot, but for some reason we need to wait until our parsha, quite late in the story, to learn that Moshe had two sons. The Torah states that when Yitro came to visit Moshe, after hearing of the great miracles, he brought not only Tzipora, Moshe's wife, but also her two sons, and that their names were Gershom and Eliezer. Moshe's children have no apparent bearing upon this narrative. Why are they mentioned? And moreover, why by name? Furthermore, in providing their names, the Torah states, Asher Shem ha'echad Gershom, the name of the one was Gershom. As Moshe said, I was a stranger, a ger, in a strange land. And then in the very next verse, the Torah states, V'shem ha'echad Eliezer, and the name of the one was Eliezer. As Moshe gave thanks that God came to my aid, Ezri, and saved me from Paro's sword. But when naming a list of two things, one usually states the name of the first one was so-and-so, and the name of the second one was so-and-so. Why does the Torah over here state about the second son Eliezer the name of the one? A number of commentaries observe that Gershom and Eliezer were very different from each other. Accordingly, each was one of a kind. The 13th century Tosafist, Rabbi Chaim Paltiel, quotes the Mechilta Midrash to explain just how different they were. When Moshe first came to Midian and met the beautiful Tzipora, he asked Yitro for her hand in marriage. Yitro agreed, but on one condition: agree that your firstborn son will be committed to the pagan religion of my people, and any sons born afterwards, they can be committed to the God of your people. And Moshe agreed and even swore to Yitro that he would keep his side of the deal. The Midrash explains why then each of Moshe's sons was the one. Gershom was singularly designated for idol worship, and Eliezer was singularly designated for worshiping God. We now understand why these two sons were introduced at this point. Yitro's bringing them back to Moshe in the desert demonstrated his willingness to surrender even Gershom to the God of the Jews. He absolved Moshe of the original contract between them because he saw the great power of God. It's shocking at first glance to read that Moshe consented to this bargain. Why did he do it? The holy Moshe would allow one of his sons to be given over to idolatry? But the Medrash is teaching us that before he had the revelation at the burning bush, even the great Moshe did not really understand the God of the Hebrews. He knew that his people had their own God, but didn't understand the idea of monotheism and what it means to serve God. Moshe was no different from anyone else of his time. In the pre-Torah world, man viewed religion as a means of garnering favor from the gods. Yitro's deal with Moshe was merely Yitro's way of blending two cultures with two different religions and deities. People in the ancient world believed that their deity was the key to receiving benefits, and Yitro simply wanted his grandchildren to have the best possible future by having the gifts of both cultures' gods. The reason why Moshe agreed was because he too was still in his pre-revelatory stage, and he understood religion the same way Yitro did. But once God revealed himself to Moshe as the unitary Yud-Ke Vav-Ke, that tetragrammaton God, creator of all, Moshe completely adjusted his paradigm. The dilemma now was, how would he deal with his wife and her family? Could they too adjust to this new religious perspective? And what about his father-in-law, who was the head priest of Midian? Moshe tried to explain the new concept of monotheism to his father-in-law. In verse 8, at the beginning of our portion, Moshe related to Yitro all the different travails they had encountered after leaving Egypt, and how Hashem had saved them from each situation. Moshe was trying to communicate that there was only one God who controls all the forces of the world and takes care of all our needs. The Medrash expresses this by stating that Moshe described to Yitro how the manna, could taste like anything that one wanted. With a God like that, Why hedge your bets with multiple deities? The Torah records that Vayichad Yitro. Yitro rejoiced over hearing the news. But the word Vayichad is a strange language to describe happiness. Rabbeinu Bechaya, the medieval commentator, suggests that it comes from the word Echad, one. That is, Yitro tried to envision what Moshe was describing, a God who was so all-encompassing that he could address any situation and control any force of nature. Yitro's comments to Moshe in verse 11, that now he saw that the God of the Jews was the most powerful of all the gods, demonstrated to Moshe that as much as Yitro tried to adapt, he was simply too set in his ways to appreciate this new concept of a monotheistic God. And Moshe mused to himself, Yitro believes in my God, and that he is more powerful than all the other gods, but he still views a pantheon of different divine beings with different powers, and he just wants to curry favor from my God along with the rest of them. After Yitro heard about all the miracles, the Torah tells us that Yitro offered sacrifices to Hashem. But in reality, this was not a real offering in the way that Jews bring korbanot. Rather, the Torah states that Vayikach Yitro in verse 12. Yitro took offerings to Elokim. The sacrifices weren't offered, but taken. They weren't given to the four-letter name of God, which is the normative term when dealing with korbanot, but rather to Elokim, just one of the other gods. Moshe's observation of Yitro's attitude is the reason why Aaron and the elders partook of Yitro's sacrifice, but Moshe is not mentioned in the verse. Realizing that Yitro was still a pagan priest, he could not bring himself to enjoy a sacrifice brought in that spirit, even though it was being offered to Hashem. And it's for the same reason that Moshe sent his father-in-law away before the giving of the Torah, in verse 27 of our portion, since Yitro could not have been able to appreciate that experience. This is why this story is especially relevant before the giving of the Torah, which comprises the bulk of the Parsha. We now gain a new perspective on the way Hashem addressed the Jewish people before and as a prelude to the giving of the Torah. The novelty of this new religion being introduced at Mount Sinai was that it called upon the nation to worship God not as a means of currying favor, but rather of elevating man into conjunction with the God of heaven and earth. In introducing Judaism to the nation, Hashem did not say, I will become your God, but rather, you will become to me a treasure from among the nations, and you will be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. There is no quid pro quo offered here, such as, if you worship me, I will give you blessings and gifts in this world. While all of that is true, that was not the foundation upon which Judaism was predicated. We became God's children, and that itself was the ample reward. What can we learn from Moshe's two sons? We don't know much about them, but we do know that in a pre-Torah world where mankind had a primitive and purely utilitarian view of religion, even one's children were used as pawns in order to find favor with the gods. I think perhaps that each of us can ask ourselves the following questions. Number one, is my view of religion like that of Yitro and pre-Torah man? Do I view my observance as a means of currying favor with God and deflecting pain and suffering? Or do I recognize that there's an ennobled function of post-Torah Judaism, which is to cleave unto God, to emulate him, and to have a meaningful connection to him? Number two, is my God in competition with the gods of other religions? Do I view other faiths with suspicion and xenophobia because they worship differently from me? Look at what happened this past week in Texas when a Muslim looked at Jews with suspicion and scorn. Let's try and embrace a more sophisticated religious lesson. As long as man is trying to narrow the gap between heaven and earth, between himself and the Creator, we should accept each other despite our differences and live and let live. And number three, and finally, for those of us blessed with children, we all have a Gershom and an Eliezer, but sometimes in the same child. It's very difficult raising children today, to be sure, with the conflicting values and messages between the Torah and secular society. It's so hard for a child to know if they will belong to paganism or Judaism. The golden mean of finding some reconciliation between the good within modern man and the Torah is not beyond our grasp, but we must be careful not to give up on any of our children in order to make a deal with Yitro or any other person in our lives. Make sure your child is the one. And so, dear friends, may our efforts to live the Torah's enlightened religious message bring us to the redemption together with our beautiful children, each one of them being so unique and special. May we see it, dear friends, bimhera b'yameinu, amen. And here's wishing you a beautiful, lovely Shabbat Shalom.